Welcome to a special crossover episode of Family Twist and Horror Heals. Now, we love a good story, especially one with twists, unexpected reveals, and maybe just a hint of horror. And let me tell you, Brad Ewell's story has all of that and more. I first connected with Brad in the most on-brand way possible, through horror. We had already interviewed him on Family Twist, but last March at the Untangling Our Roots Summit, something pretty serendipitous happened. Picture this. It's the final morning of the summit. I've just spent half the night in deep emotional conversations, so much so that I lost my voice. And if you know me, that's really saying something. So instead of rocking one of my usual flashy suits, I throw on an Exorcist t-shirt and shuffle down to the lobby, just trying to keep low profile. And that's when Brad spotted me. Horror fans always find each other. So we got to talking, and the next thing I know, I'm learning that this guy isn't just a horror fan, he's an artist making these incredible prints of horror icons on actual pages from the books they came from. And then, like any good horror movie, the story takes a turn. Brad's personal journey sounds like something ripped straight from a psychological thriller. A DNA test taken on a whim, a message from a stranger, a secret buried for decades, and a single moment, one phone call that changed everything. So let's dive in. Brad, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm excited to see y'all and talk to you.
Yeah, us too. We love the idea of being able to do a crossover episode of both of our podcasts. Let me set the scene for listeners. Kind of fortuitous that I attended the Untangling Our Roots Summit last March, and Brad had already been a guest on the Family Twist podcast, but on the morning that we were wrapping up, Sunday morning, I was like in the lobby with people like crying and stuff till like 2 a.m. until finally my voice was gone. And so I had to go, and I woke up, not feeling fantastic. So I kind of like, rather than being in one of my flashy suits, I just went like, sort of incognito down to the lobby to get my stuff. But I was wearing an Exorcist t-shirt, and Brad spotted that. And then we immediately started talking about his artwork. So maybe we could just jump in right there. Like, where did your passion for horror-themed artwork come from?
So there was such a long lag for me in not having a passion for art and just doing everything I could to ignore it. And then really what happened for me was in 2023, I blew my knee up at work one day and had surgery that left me in a locked out leg brace for about 4 months.
Wow.
And so we have a 2-story house. I made it upstairs once, and that's where I stayed for 4 months.
Wow.
And my wife grabbed me. She remembered back when I was in high school, I used to love lino cut printing, where you carve into a linoleum block and then print it. And she realized I was going to pretty quickly get bored sitting up in our bedroom all day. And she brought that, and my immediate thought was, oh, I'm sitting up here watching scary movies. What horror movie art could I do sitting here watching movies? And that's really how it started.
Awesome. Well, listeners, Brad sent us some beautiful pieces of art that we received a couple of days ago, and we just been looking at them and just reflecting on them. I really love the concept of creating a piece of horror art on a page of the book that's, the horror story takes place in. So you sent us a really cool Hannibal Lecter from Silence of the Lambs. So where did you get that idea, like, to start producing artwork on actual book pages?
It was something that I had simply never seen before. I've seen lots of printmaking, and I think everybody that is an artist and wants to do art wants to do something just a little bit different. And I started looking for, okay, so I'm going to make this print. What could I do to make it different than anybody else's Hannibal Lecter print? And I suddenly started thinking, I'm one of those people that if Corey, you and I've already had this experience where you tell me there's a movie, but then I find out there's a book of that movie. I have to go read that book.
Yeah.
So for me, every horror movie that had started as a book, I've read that before I've seen it. And that just seemed like the perfect way to tie both of those pieces of art together. Because there's a lot of people, books like The Exorcist and Jaws, people know that those were books before they were movies.
Right.
You go to the movie that you pushed me towards, Found, a lot of people aren't going to know that that was a book ever.
Right. True. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and there's this sort of, back in the 80s, it was pretty common for there to be like novelizations of movies, like after the movie came out or when the movie came out. And that's starting to become like a thing again. I've noticed with like some of these indie movies, they're doing novelizations of Pearl and X. And then there was just in time for the 50th anniversary, a Black Christmas novelization, limited edition that
Oh,
came out that Lynn Griffin did the introduction for. So it's kind of cool to see it kind of like coming back, that the whole idea of the retro novelization coming back into this way.
well, and I think we're all close to the same age. So for me, it's changed so much because before the movie was always going to be a little less than the book because you couldn't fit a book into 2-ish hours of a movie.
Mhm.
And now that Amazon and Netflix and everybody are doing 8-part series, you actually get to see an entire book made into a movie finally.
Good point. It's true. So interesting. I didn't know about the aspect of you having to have surgery. So like, we talk about horror can be healing in so many different ways, and literally like you were healing while you were creating horror art and watching horror movies.
Yes. Yep. My knee was slowly putting itself back together.
So did you have his horror movies have been like a lifelong thing for you?
I have liked them as long as I can remember. My fascination started back with the early Friday the 13th. Some people will argue whether it's a horror movie or not. My first horror movie memories are Jaws, and seeing that, I guess I would have been about 5.5 with parents that loved Southern California beach vacations. And that really jacked up vacations for me for a while because going out in the ocean didn't seem that cool.
And we were back to the lake.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about that this morning, about like Jaws. Is Jaws a horror movie? I'm thinking, yeah. And then immediately I'm thinking of the scene where like the head, comes out underwater. It's like, yeah. I mean, it's a horror movie. I don't care that the whole thing takes place in the daylight on the beach. It's definitely a horror movie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So awesome. So let's talk a little bit about the flip side of your story. I know you've shared it on the Family Twist podcast, but I believe you were around age 42 when you and your wife decided to gift each other DNA kits.
Yep, I've been working on writing this story, and I just found we did Ancestry. I found the email receipt for it in 2015. I'd have been 44, I guess. 45. I think it was 45 by the time we did the kids.
Yeah. So you were going in there sort of expecting to find out like, where am I from? But you literally found out where you were from.
Yes. So, I mean, we did it as a pure for fun thing. It didn't turn out to be as fun as it sounded at first, but like the dad that raised me was an airline pilot and an international pilot. So I had always asked when he'd go overseas, I'm like, hey, get our family crest and stuff like that. I'm curious where we came from. And the answer I always got was, nobody cares about that. And I eventually learned that, okay, apparently that's not something you ask about. So I blew it off. And then, you fast forward decades and all of a sudden you can spit in a tube and send it off to this company and find out where you came from. Well, I couldn't get my dad to bring stuff back. So that seemed like the easiest way to find out. So, I mean, we did that in 2015. And when we did it, I'm still shocked to this day that my raising parents that hadn't told me I was adopted came over to the house. My wife's parents came over. We Chromecast all that on the TV, showed them the results, and everybody sat there like, wow, that's really neat. And nobody said a word about what could come from this later. The discovery was actually in 2019. So I floated for 4 years still with no clue that anything was coming.
You hadn't really been messing around with the relative side of things.
No, I mean, my paradigm was so locked into where I came from that it never even occurred to me to look. I mean, why would I go look at people I already know are going to be on a list?
Right,
the only thing I really wanted to see was A, I wanted to know if I was Irish, and B, if I wasn't, where I came from in the world. And once I saw that map, I was kind of like, okay, cool. So I'm English, kind of Irish and Scottish, a little bit Norwegian, done.
Yeah. Whereas for me, it would have been the complete opposite because I was, going in there hoping, well, A, to find out the ethnic stuff, but also to see people. And of course, I didn't recognize any of the names, which makes
Right.
perfectly good sense.
Well, I mean, had I looked at my matches, I would have realized I don't know
Right.
who any of these people are, but I
Right.
didn't care to look because I that was
Right.
not a curiosity.
Yep.
So, what got you to the revelation that you were indeed adopted?
So in 2019, about 4 years after we took the test, a woman reached out to us through, I didn't realize Ancestry had like its own little email messenger. And my
Mhm.
wife had stayed on there because she was playing around building our family trees and doing genealogy. And she got this message that just said, I'm trying to figure out how I'm related to this BE person on your account. So she asked me and showed me the lady's name. And I mean, looking back now, I feel so stupid saying this, but it never occurred to me to go to the matches and see who this person was. I was like, well, I don't know who she is. And my wife's like, well, what do you think? I was like, you're welcome to talk to her, but I don't have a clue who she is. And I grew up the child of an only child. I was an only child myself. And then my mom was an only child. And my dad had one brother, and they didn't really talk much. So we were kind of a really insulated small family. So having somebody pop out of the woodwork that might be an aunt wasn't weird. So Pam told me, she said, well, do you care if I talk to her and we try to figure out how she's related to you? I don't care at all. I'm not really curious or that interested, but sure. So they carried on for the better part of probably 2 or 3 weeks of just talking back and forth, trying to figure out how I was related to her. A backside of this story that I've still never fully looked into yet was I learned probably 5, 6 years before my adoption discovery that the mom that raised me also may have been a late discovery adoptee. Still am not sure to this day. Her mother told her she was adopted pretty close to when her mom died, and my mom did not want to look into it at all, and she's since passed. So we really don't know. At some point, I'll try to dig into it, but now we're talking about adoption records from back in the 40s. So it's
Right.
it's a little more legwork. I mean, from 70 was bad enough. From the 40s, I don't know what there is. This lady was, I think, 2 or 3 years younger than my mom, and I was like, could be easily a cousin, a half sibling if she's adopted, and that's how we've matched here. So that was the assumption my wife was working off of, and they talked back and forth for quite a while. My wife gave her all the information she could think of to let this woman go into Ancestry and see if she could figure that out. And after about 3 weeks, my wife and I were out on a lunch date, and she gets a text and she looks at her phone, and we've been together at this point for, let's see, 2019 would be 27 years. So she gets a text and she makes a face that I immediately know isn't a good face. It's, something's off. And I'm like, so what's that? And she said, well, that lady that I've been talking to through Ancestry just texted me, and I'm not sure how you're going to feel about this. And I was like, well, we can't leave that can of worms closed up now that we've just cracked it open like that. So what did she say? And she said, well, she said that her sister had a baby boy in Dallas on your birthday, and she believes it's you, and your parents never told you you're adopted. And I sat with that for a second, and then really we both laughed it off because it made no sense in my world that that was a possibility. So we laughed it off, and I told my wife, I was like, I've gone from being ambivalent about this to kind of feeling bad because this lady is way off on the wrong track. So ask her what hospital she thinks I was born in. I'll go home that night, get my birth certificate out, and we can compare notes. And if nothing else, I can get her back on the right track. So that was where that conversation ended for that time. And then it turned out I was way more wrong than she was.
Well, I mean, just the birth date alone, is shocking, you know.
It was. And at the same time, I think some of it is psychologically you try to protect yourself. But in my brain, my immediate thought was, how many baby boys were born in Dallas on my birthday? At
Right.
least probably 15, 20, 30.
Right.
So what are the odds? And, I'm asking the hospital because maybe that's in one hospital. If you do the whole Metroplex, how many baby boys were born here that day?
Yeah. Yeah. At what point did you think, like, well, maybe I should have a conversation with my parents about this?
I avoided that like the plague. It was literally the last thing I wanted to do. So that night I came home and pulled out my birth certificate. I'd used it to apply for jobs and things for 30-ish years by then. I'd never really looked at it. So I pulled it out and I immediately go, okay, there's a box for the actual address or hospital that you were born in. And I'm like, I'm going to start there because that's what I've asked this lady to tell me. And mine had a dash in it. There's no location. And I was like, well, that's kind of weird. So then I start going over my birth certificate and noticing, there's things that I would think would be on there. Like there's a place where the father signs as the witness to the birth, or somebody signs as the witness to the birth. Mine had my dad's name typed in. And I was like, well, that doesn't make sense because you should have to sign that as the witness. So then I pulled my wife's birth certificate out because she was born in 1970 in Dallas as well, and put the two side by side. And that's when the wheels really started to come off the bus because neither one of them, they looked like they were two completely separate documents. Mine looks like an old microfiche copy. Hers looks like a legitimate legal document that someone typed up and signed. But even after that, I looked at it and thought to myself, well, I mean, okay, yeah, it's different. It's weird. But that's probably what a 1970s copy of a birth certificate looked like. And I bet my parents lost mine at some point. Easy peasy, makes sense. It sticks with my little paradigm, and I'm much happier with the way things are than having this big change. So that's an easy acceptance. But at the same time, I was sitting there racking my brain trying to think of, has my mom ever told my parents lived close to us our whole lives. They were there for all three of our kids' births. And I'm like, did my mom ever talk about when I was born? And the more I racked my brain, the more I realized no. There was never a story. There was never, I think it's a standard mom guilt trip of, I was in labor with you for this many hours and this is how you treat me. I had
Yeah.
never heard it. So then my parents were also big on taking pictures. So I start racking my brain like, a pregnant picture of my mom. Surely I've seen a pregnant picture of my mom. And once again, no, I can't think of one. So then when we got back home, Pam's parents, my wife's parents were at our house. So I was in one room messing with all these ideas, and Pam was in the room with her parents actually talking genealogy and stuff like that. So I just kind of stuck my head around the corner and said, hey, did that lady ever tell you that place that we were asking her about? And she grabbed her phone and she said, well, she doesn't have the address, but she remembers it was this little women's clinic on a street called Turner Avenue in Dallas. And it was a white building with green awnings. Well, I can't tell you what my face looked like, but I can tell you my heart just sunk because I knew exactly where she was talking about. I had been there over and over again as a kid. It was 2-ish miles from my grandparents' house. And there was this nice doctor, Dr. Carmichael, who was a family friend that every time we would go see my grandma and grandpa, we would stop in and see Dr. Carmichael on the way. And, I never thought anything of it. It just adults were seeing each other and I'm the kid tagging along and you go hang out and leave. So as soon as she mentioned the place, I Googled it, made sure that I wasn't crazy. And sure enough, here's this white brick building with green awnings and the big old 70s glass mosaic brick tiles that go in the wall that you can't really see through but let light in.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting there like, oh no, I've been to this place a lot. And that's more of a coincidence than I really liked. But still, the last thing, I mean, I can't speak for everybody, but I can speak for myself when I finally had to do it. But the last thing I want to do is call my mom and dad and be like, hey, did y'all adopt me and not tell me? That's a weird conversation to have in general. We got the idea, actually, my wife had the idea. We had a good friend from church at the time that had known she was adopted her whole life. Right after 9/11, decided life was too short. She wanted to find her biological family, went through the whole headache of unsealing birth records, was able to decipher a signature on a piece of non-identifying information actually found her birth mom, then found her birth dad, and had reconnected with her bio family. So we thought that would be an easy way, somebody great to talk to that could maybe point me in a direction that I could at least have something tangible to go off of before I made this phone call. Because, I mean, ultimately, if my parents had kept this a secret for coming up on, at this point, 50 years, and I said, hey, am I adopted? And they said, no. Well, there's this other person out here in the world saying I'm adopted with all this really weird stuff going on. So it wouldn't get me anywhere. So I wanted to have something more concrete than just an answer at this point. So it's now the next day, I call our friend from church and I'm telling her my story. She said, well, hey, do you have a copy of your birth certificate? I said, I do. And she said, well, send it to me. I'm going to hang up. I'm going to go find mine and I'll call you back. Well, we had known each other for probably a decade by then. And when she called me back, her name's Jan, I got a different Jan on the phone. We had a very fun, hey, how's everybody doing? Blah, blah, blah conversation. And when she called me back, it was, hey. And I'm like, oh, I don't like how that sounds. Hey, it's kind of like when the doctor comes in to tell you bad news, start. And she's like, I'm going to send you a copy of my birth certificate to look at. And I said, okay, no problem. So my phone dings, I look at it. And my first thought is, oh, she actually accidentally sent me my birth certificate back. So I blow it up and I realize, no, it's hers. And she was born, I think, in 1968 in Texas. And her birth certificate and mine are the exact same. Same black microfiche copy, same missing information, same type things where there should be signatures. And I'm like, oh, no. And she said, I don't really know an easy way to tell you this, but I looked it up before I called you back. And this is what adoption birth certificates in Texas looked like in the 1970s. So more than likely, this lady's right, you're adopted. But still, how can I find out without asking my parents? Because I still don't want to. Yeah. It still sounds like a horrible idea to make this phone call. And she walked me through what she had done. And at the end, basically told me, you can do all the gist of it was you can present all the evidence you want to the court that granted your adoption. And at the end of the day, the judge will say, sure, I'll let you see your records, or no, I won't. And there's no recourse afterwards. There's no appeal process. It's just they let you see it or they don't. And she's like, so A, that's going to take you a few months. And B, you're just rolling dice. It's just if they decide they want to, they do. So your real best bet is to ask your parents. And I'm like, oh, that's, once again, the whole reason we're on the phone is that's not what I want to do today. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of what pushed me to the actual conversation.
It's a difficult conversation to approach. Like, how do you even start something like that?
Well, so I mean, for a living for quite a while, I've had difficult conversations with people. So I'm like, I'll come up with this awesome plan. And so just backstory for me and my raising family. I was very close with my dad. My mom and I struggled in our relationship for our whole lives. Just a sad fact. So my immediate thought was, well, it's not weird for me to get a hold of my dad. My mom and dad were married until they both passed. But it was not out of place for me to call my dad and be like, hey, I want to talk to you. I've got a couple things I'm trying to figure out, and it would be easier if it was just you and I. That wasn't a weird thing to have to do. So I was like, that's what I'll do. And dad would have been, I guess, 70, 79 at this time. So he had a cell phone, but like most older folks, that cell phone stayed turned off in a drawer in the house unless he went somewhere. So I built up this grand plan in my head of I'm at work when all this is going on. And I'm like, I'm going to call him about 6, 7 at night. He'll be at home. The phone will be turned off in a drawer. And I'm just going to leave a message. Hey, we haven't seen each other in a little while. I'm like, we hadn't seen each other and caught up. Let's meet up and have coffee, have a beer, have lunch, whatever is fine. By the way, there's a couple things I'm trying to figure out. Nothing bad is happening. But if you and I could just meet for lunch, that would be great. So that was my grand plan. I'm going to call, leave this message on his cell phone, and it's going to be perfect. And the plan was perfect right till he answered the phone. And I'm like, shh. shit, no, you're not supposed to answer the phone. This is supposed to be a message. So I quickly gather my thoughts up again. I'm like, okay, I can still do this live. It's the same thing. It's just with a person instead of leaving a message now. So I start off, hey, we haven't seen each other in a while. I thought it'd be fun to catch up. I'm like, nobody's broke. Nobody's sick. The kids are great. Nobody's getting divorced. Everybody's fine. Nothing is wrong. But it'd be fun to see you. And I am trying to do a couple things with work and things like that. It'd just be good if you and I could catch up and I could bounce some ideas off of you. And this is a conversation I would say we've had hundreds of times. And the answer had always been, sure, here's a day I'm free. Does that work for you? And for once, he says, sure. Why? What do you want to talk about? And I was like, well, like I said, nobody's sick, nobody's broke, nobody needs money, and blah, 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 my whole list again. Just pick a time, Dad, and we'll meet. And he's like, yeah, sure. I definitely want to pick a time, but I want to know what we're going to talk about. And I feel like, we've all had a situation where time slows down. I felt like we circled that drain for an hour. It was probably a minute of me explaining how we didn't need to do this right now and him coming back to, yeah, but why? So finally I got to a point and I was like, okay, there's nothing else I can do here. So I said, Dad, you understand I'm trying not to have a phone conversation with you? And he goes, yeah, oh yeah, I understand. I just want to know what we're going to talk about and then I'll meet you. And I was like, okay, so well, here we go. So he was the one that had told me that my mom had found out that she was possibly adopted. My mom had never told me, and I come from obviously a solid family of secret keepers. So I was told never to tell my mom that I knew that she was possibly adopted. So he and I had this conversation she and I never had. So that's what I started with. Well, do you remember how you told me that Mom was adopted? Oh, yeah, sure. I remember that. I said, and you remember we did this ancestry test? Oh, yeah. I said, well, this woman reached out to us through Ancestry. And I was picking my words so carefully, trying to at some point have him just catch a glimpse of what might be coming to shut this down. Because even as much as I wanted to know, I didn't want to do this on the phone, especially not sitting at work on the phone, because, that's not the place to do anything like this. So I'm like, well, so this woman reached out to us and we thought, I put a big, hard emphasis on, that it could be Mom's cousin, half-sister, something like that. And he went, well, that's fascinating. I didn't realize they could do stuff like that. I was like, yeah, apparently they can. And I pause again, thinking, in a minute, his brain is going to catch up to where we are and realize, oh, I don't want to do this anymore right now. It doesn't work. So I sigh again. I'm like, but it turns out that's not what she thinks. And he's like, oh, well, what is it? I said, well, she said that her sister had a baby boy in Dallas on my birthday, and she thinks it's me, and she believes y'all adopted me and never told me. And so I haven't said it on the show yet on this one. So at this point, I'd been a cop for 24 years. And most of my life has been asking questions and expecting certain responses. So I had a laundry list of things that would have been good responses from my dad. Like, that woman is crazy. She's out to try to get money from you. Avoid her. I was waiting for any of those. And what I got was, and not another word. And I was like, oh no. For me, that at that moment right there, I was like, well, no, she's right.
Yeah.
And so what I learned later was I could hear my dad's fingers drumming. It turned out I managed to call at the time that he took a 10-minute run to the store, or all of my plan would have worked out perfect. But so he's sitting in the car by himself, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. And I'm sitting there waiting for something to happen. And finally I said, Dad, I don't want to be a dick. And I know this is hard, but you're going to have to say it out loud. I already know the answer. There's no more surprise here. But until you say it, I'm going to question if I'm reading this right, even though I'm 100% sure I am. And he drummed for another few seconds and went, well, Bradley, you're adopted and we've been trying to figure out how to tell you.
Brad, your story is the definition of a slow burn thriller. The little clues, the unanswered questions, that creeping sense that something isn't quite right. And then that gut punch moment on the phone with your dad, when you're expecting reassurance, but all you get is silence. And what I love is that you took all of this, the shock, the unraveling of your identity, and you found a way to channel it into something creative. Horror has this incredible way of giving us permission to process the things that feel too big, too overwhelming, too painful. And for you, that took the form of art. I mean, let's just appreciate how perfect it is that you're printing horror icons onto actual book pages from the stories they came from. It's like you're stitching together the past and the present, much like you had to do with your own life. All right, here's the best part. This is just part one of Brad's story, because trust, this journey, it only gets wilder from here. So whether you're listening on Family Twist or Horror Heals, stay with us. You're not going to miss what happens next. Brad, thanks for sharing this chapter of your journey with us. We'll pick up right where we left off next time.